Good to be with you, Yvonne. Well, there are, as you say, two schools of thought. There are many serving and former US generals and European generals who have a position. They say that Ukraine is facing a very difficult challenge. It has to proceed slowly to avoid loss of life as best it can. It doesn't have the NATO equipment, doesn't have air superiority and the anti-mine equipment to go through quickly. It did try going through quickly. It was pinned down by artillery fire, so it's now taking a slow and steady path of trying to punch through to the Sea of Azov. And of course, there's that other view that is being put around, leaving aside Russian disinformation campaigns where there's just exaggerated ideas put around. There are some military analysts and military personnel who think that Ukraine should be going faster. I'm not the expert that these people are, but when I look at this, it seems to me that Ukraine is doing remarkably well. It does have to prioritize preserving life over speed. Of course, it doesn't have forever. The autumn rains are coming. The ground will turn to very sticky grey mud. So there is pressure. But we're just getting news today of a breakthrough through the first line of defence, pushing down from the Zaporizhzhia region. That seems like encouraging news.
Well, as you say, autumn's coming and then winter's soon to set in as well. It seems like a race against time, but that's such a challenge, isn't it, for Ukraine, who you say should be progressing at a slow and steady pace. What should the focus be on from here on?
Well, I think we need to understand that there's a real lag of information flows deliberately. I mean, this is war, and it's a war of information as much as anything else. So Ukraine doesn't want to give an advantage to Russia. So we probably are seeing things sort of a week in hindsight in many respects, at least a week to get clarity. One of the things that Ukraine has done very well, Yvonne, is attrit the Russian forces to sort of push the Russians, like in Bakhmut, for example, to losing tens of thousands of lives for no purpose and losing lots of rounds of ammunition and artillery pieces. And they will keep on trying to do that whilst on their own side avoid loss of life as far as possible. But we're looking for a breakthrough, probably from this Zaporizhzhia region down to the Sea of Azov, that cuts through the highway that runs through Mariupol and links the Crimean Peninsula with the Donetsk region that Russia holds. So if we see signs of that happening, then we'll know that Ukraine is achieving the progress it wants to see. They are facing time with autumn and winter coming, but they also have a sense of not wanting to be rushed in this because in some ways, time is on their side. The Russians are the ones who are really facing difficult problems with logistics and supplies.
How has the war in Ukraine been impacted by the death of Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, which we learnt about last week?
Well, I think the first thing we can say is that most people would see that as being good news. The second thing is we don't know what its direct impact. We do know that the Wagner fighters were led by some very experienced fighters, even though they had sort of prison convicts and others making up the rear of their ranks. And they were a formidable fighting force in Ukraine. And so it's good news that the Wagner leadership is taken out and Wagner is no longer operational in Ukraine. So that's good news just in terms of what they were achieving, but also in terms of morale. We get all these reports of Russian morale collapsing for good reason. It would be pretty awful to be a Russian conscript at any time, but particularly conscripted to Ukraine at the moment. They're running out of supplies. There's a real disregard for Russian life in the way that they push their troops forward. And I think the news of Wagner would just further, one of the things that people liked about Prigozhin is they thought he spoke truth to power. Of course, he was in that power circle himself, but he was calling things like many saw on the ground. And so seeing him taken out in that sort of spectacular mafia hit, as it were, that deliberate, over-the-top violence, blowing up an aircraft in mid-flight, I think that will be demoralizing to the Russians. So I think that's actually not a very smart move by Putin. Good in the short term, makes him look strong. In the longer term, I'm not so sure that's going to help him.
How was that flight taken down? What do you think happened that caused the death of Prigozhin and his team? And do you think investigators will ever get to the bottom of this?
That's a really good question about what information we'll have. It appears that the aircraft disintegrated in flight in a really catastrophic fashion. So that's not an engine failure. It's not even any sort of mechanical failure we can imagine with this modern executive jet that's pretty reliable. Either an explosive device planted on the aircraft and detonated, or a surface-to-air missile, probably the former, but a catastrophic disintegration of the aircraft. So it plummeted out of the sky. It didn't sort of crash. It didn't struggle. It was taken down. And that was meant as a sign to everyone in Russia that, look, this is what happens when you cross Vladimir Putin. So we don't sort of need to know the details of how it was done or even how the chain of command went. It has the hallmarks of the GRU, the Russian military intelligence, who often is behind assassinations. And that's, I think, the message that people are meant to understand.
How is Vladimir Putin viewed in his own country, and how do you think this has changed since the start of the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think one thing we need to acknowledge, Yvonne, is that Vladimir Putin has been a spectacularly popular leader, and he's moved Russia over the last 18 months from being authoritarian to totalitarian. So that control of the media is pretty much now total. So for those who are glued to the Russian state media, television broadcasts and others, they probably still have a fairly positive view. But a lot of younger people, of course, have fled Russia, 1 million plus. People who have encrypted internet connections, who can virtual links, who get a broader view of what's happening. I think there's a slow collapse in Putin's reputation, but how quickly that collapse occurs, I think his leadership is brittle, but whether that means it falls apart over the next 6 months or whether he clings to power for another 6 years, we don't know.
Well, in February, it'll be 2 years since the war began. Do you think fighting will continue until and beyond early next year?
I think that this war won't be finished early next year, whether we end up in a kind of frozen conflict. And that was what happened in 2014, of course. The Crimean Peninsula was taken, Donbass was taken, and then it froze, supposedly as a result of peace talks, but those peace talks weren't honoured. This time around, it's quite likely that the Russian forces will hang on to that eastern Donbass area. Whether they retain operational control of the Crimean Peninsula, whether it's a useful military base for them, remains to be seen. I think that's what the Ukrainians are very much hoping to deny the Russians. And whether they can achieve that by February, I think there's reason to believe it's possible. But as you were just discussing, that would occur through autumn and winter, and that's pretty tough. So go forward another 12 months, I think we'll still have Russian forces in the east, and perhaps the conflict will be frozen. But the Ukrainians have managed to take back half of the territory that was taken from them since February of last year. I mean, they have made progress. They're now stuck with these deeply fortified lines, mined at an incredible rate. It's very hard to advance through those. So this is the hard stage coming now.
Professor Greg Barton, good to get your analysis. Thanks so much.
Great to chat, Yvonne. Thanks.
Thank you.